Hello BookTube, I'm Scott.
And now?
We're Gunpowder Fiction and Plot, and this is another panel discussion video.
Woo! It's been a while.
A few months ago, the governor of Texas banned a whole bunch of books, and it just sort of sparked this whole banned book conversation. And we thought we'd get 8 of BookTube's finest help us discuss some issues. So, let's have a look at the 8 BookTubers we've got.
Yeah.
Hello, Scott and Nell. Thank you for inviting me to participate in your online forum.
Hi everyone, Rosie Cockshed here. I am so beyond excited to be on this panel. Seriously, Scott and Nell's discussion videos are some of my favorite things on BookTube. They're always so fascinating to me.
And that freedom should be protected.
Hi, I'm Josh, here to record some answers to some questions on book banning and censorship.
Hey, it's Leo from the channel Leo Bancroft.
Hi there, I'm Jen. My channel is called Remembered Reads, and today I'm answering some questions about censorship.
Hi, it's me, Kevy.
Hello, Scott and Nell. Thank you so much for asking me to take part in this discussion. I'm really excited about this.
I think it's going to be confusing having 2 people called Jen on this panel.
We should nickname them Jen the Swearing Librarian and Jen the Brain Explosion Lady.
What would you do if reading books was banned entirely? I'd be in prison. I'm not stopping.
I'd become a black market reader. I'd go like underground, like stealth underground, because I truly believe that individual freedoms, liberty, and the ability to consume knowledge is crucial to critical thinking and personal independence, and that freedom should be protected.
I'd like to think that I'd keep reading, and I envision creating some sort of secret book sharing system. I definitely would want to continue to network with other book lovers and librarians and find ways to keep reading and teaching alive, even if it were banned. Would I be brave enough? You know, we often ask ourselves the question, what would we do if we lived in times such as? And honestly, starting my BookTube channel was my response to what would I do in times such as these that we are in right now. I'd like to think that I would still find a way to use my voice and find a platform to fight against the banning of reading. Would I risk imprisonment if reading books was banned entirely? I hope so. I hope I'd be strong enough.
I think the thing you need to know about librarians is that we love breaking rules. If someone says to me this book is banned, in fact all books are banned, I'd start a little black market library. I'd be like going around in my van at night. I'd have like a little, I'd have a little whistle or a little tune that I can play so that people know the library is in the neighbourhood. And then I'd like open the back of my car and then like be dealing books to people. But not like for money, because I believe in freedom of information and information should be free. I would 100% be in prison for continuing to read books.
Rebels!
I think we've created a clique for when the dystopian begins.
Or we've created the first evidence that will be used to hang them. Sorry!
I have this vision of Kim like looking both ways as she comes out of her front door as she hears Greensleeves playing and there's a bus coming in the distance. She comes up to Jen and she's, what have you got by Toni Morrison?
Never mind, they're on different continents. BookTube fantasies.
It's easy to say what we think we would do, what we'd like to think we would do, and even what we believe we would do. I think we all overestimate the willpower of the human body in difficult circumstances. The ability of us to fight the pressures of an oppressive system, regardless of the context, is easier said than done. And the fact is, there are some people who manage to do it, and there's evidence of the strength of certain communities. But I question whether or not I or anyone else could really not break in that system. Hopefully it would be the context where my current self gets put in that position in the future versus like existing in it now. Like, it's complicated because who I am now is defined by where I've been. We have to be talking about my personality being put in that situation in the future. I guess, I mean, it's convoluted, but it matters because it helps that I have the views, or I guess the information that I have in my mind right now to help think about what is right and what is wrong and what is appropriate reaction. And there's a lot of things about this. I don't think this is a realistic situation because of the internet, but of course I guess there are communities like North Korea or China who manage to oppress people from certain mindsets. But even then, there's always going to be access. I'm pretty sure even in Fahrenheit 451, I'm pretty sure they still find books there. So even in the most oppressive systems, you can find them. There will be the ability. The threat, the risks involved is what's scary. I mean, I just read 1984 for the second time, and if that's the kind of system I'm fighting against, I mean, it's only a matter of time before I break. My fear is would I even be able to survive? Because I would probably try to fight it. I would likely resort to some sort of violence. I mean, I don't think I would be content in a society that is that oppressive. I wouldn't respect its laws. Of course, would that be productive? And how long would I survive? So it's either that or the other section where I'm so desperate to live that I am so much of a coward that I can't break free of that. And I guess that's the reality. It's not really telling you what I would do, because I can't say what I would do until I'm in the moment. And I just think it's important for us to recognize that we don't really know what we do in that kind of situation until we're in it. And I think it's also important outside of this question because of the context of, I think, empathy and our tendency to judge individuals in positions to make important decisions on really important topics that are sometimes very unclear. It's so easy to see a binary from the outside until you're in that situation.
This feels like an impossibility to me. How could they ever ban reading books entirely? But I will answer the question and say, I just think that human beings are natural storytellers. We tell stories. Everybody who has a BookTube channel tells stories about the books they read and the lives they live, the things they've read, and stories about things that they've done. We are storytellers, and we have been since, the very first whatever humanoid type critters gathered around fires. They told stories about what they did that day. We are not going to stop telling stories. Would the plots of books and those things get lost? Yeah, but they might mutate into something else. 500 years from now, somebody would just rewrite the Odyssey or rewrite Pride and Prejudice based on an old folk story they heard, which was passed down through telling tales. So I don't think we're likely to lose the storytelling, the information sharing process. It'll just would become less efficient if we couldn't read.
And I guess it would depend what that would mean. Are we saying there's a ban on storytelling? Because I think that gets back to a lot of language laws, because that is interrupting a storytelling tradition is what part of language repression does. And so are we saying that happens for every language, or is it literally physical books are being banned and someone's going to try to take all these books? I don't know how that works out. Are we talking about a kind of class-based genocide where, like happened in Cambodia in the 70s, are people with a certain level of education, are they getting wiped out? What does it mean if reading books is banned entirely? I need to know more about this theoretical situation. Is there an environmental problem with having physical books and we're going to read ebooks? Are literacy rates going to suddenly drop off for a certain reason? How would it happen? There need to be more details, because it's hard to know how to react without knowing what the specifics of that are.
Well, Jen's terrified me. That's really what's happened there. Jen has raised a whole bunch of different scenarios that all are horrific.
I like that she is incapable of... Are you like, it's almost like, are you sure books are banned? I'm unable to accept this. No. I think they've all raised a really good point. Josh brought up Fahrenheit 451, where like somebody is responsible for reading Marcus Aurelius and then like verbally telling it to other people.
Yeah.
And of course, this is just storytelling, which is what Brian and Jen both brought up, that you can ban books, but you're not going to ban that instinct of passing on
information. You can't actually ban thought and ideas without creating some sense of ignorance in the population first.
Yeah.
Which is what Jen got into a little bit, and that was truly scary.
I liked Josh when he was, well, we can say what we're going to fight back.
Yeah, we would all like to think that we would be Jen with our green sleeves ban of books.
I legitimately think Jen would be part of the book resistance. So
I don't disagree.
I think she'd have a little notch on her bed for every man she's killed. But, yeah.
Why her bed?
I think I'm maybe using a metaphor that I'm...
You've taken a sexy metaphor.
I think I've grabbed something from the past and misappropriated it somewhat.
Honestly, this at first seemed like the hardest question, and then the more I thought about it, it's actually the easiest question. Because in my view, if we get to a point where reading books has been banned, that's not the biggest issue here. Maybe I'm being unimaginative, maybe I need to read more dystopian, but I can't see a situation where a government was in power that was in power enough to make reading illegal and also enforce that. I feel like we have issues before we get to reading. I feel like there'd be a lot of concerns that come up before we get to we're controlling your media consumption to that extent. I can't speculate about how I would react to that particular loss of rights, because I would be a fundamentally different person because of everything that had already happened to get to that point. I'm probably just copying out of this question, but, well, that's what I'm gonna do.
I would listen to them.
I would listen to them. I love that loophole.
I also could listen to Kevy's laugh on a loop for like all day.
Kevy should narrate audiobooks. That should
Yes.
be her job, Kevy.
Particularly ones from the perspective of evil bitches.
Joy, evil joy.
Yeah.
Rosie makes a really good point here that we're not just going to like randomly wake up and go, all your books are banned. We're going to have human right infringements along the way to get there.
The realism of the response to this question sort of took me by surprise and has terrified me a couple of times. Not just because these thoughts are like of a scary future, but also because you can definitely see signs in our society of this sort of trend in government control in recent politics. And I'm not saying we all live in a 1984 scenario. I think that is probably a bit extreme, but
We do live in
does that mean that we're not heading towards it? Like, I don't know, but I don't.
I mean,
it makes me uncomfortable.
We do live in a system where we have lots of warning signs for this, though. We have cronyism, we have corruption, we have lack of trust in science, all of these things in all of our Western societies. They'll all lead to hardcore fascism and things like book banning. We've got them all.
Yeah.
We're just waiting for people to do things like, I don't know, overturn Roe v. Wade or something. What do you think about government banning, censoring, or somehow limiting access to books like Mein Kampf, Just Evil, or The Anarchist Cookbook, potentially dangerous instruction and information? So if you're not in the know, Mein Kampf was written by Hitler, who was obviously not a cool guy, and The Anarchist Cookbook is an instruction manual for how to build bombs. So we're going to stick with Kevy and Rosie, and they're going to start us off with the answers to this question.
Regarding books like Mein Kampf or The Anarchist Cookbook, I'm torn. I don't have a very strong opinion either way because, on the one hand, I think it's important to be able to learn and understand our history so that we don't repeat it like we're repeating it fucking right now. Sorry. But at the same time, Nazis don't deserve a fucking voice. They're a bunch of scum, nothing, shit-stained people. They don't deserve to have a voice or to be represented in what we read and ingest and stuff. We can learn about our history without having to get into the head of that dumb fucking asshole who's like, I'm a painter, but my life is so hard because of these nasty-ass people. Like, no, you're the nasty-ass motherfucker, bitch. Let's just get rid of them stupid-ass books. We don't need them anymore. Yay, I have an opinion now, thank you. Shit.
This is one of the topics that in my own thought I have the most trouble reconciling. I find it really, really hard to know where that line should be drawn. On one hand, flat out banning books and no one's allowed to access this, it's completely illegal, that seems like too far. But totally unrestricted access, Mein Kampf is circulating in elementary school libraries with no sort of context, also doesn't seem appropriate. So I feel like there's a line in that gray area, but I really don't know where it is.
I think it's interesting to see their thought processes here.
Yeah, I think booktubers get really used to thinking aloud on camera, and these are definitely two examples. We get to see the clock ticking.
I think that the points of view they've come to are really interesting in comparison to what we've got next.
Generally speaking, I don't think the government should be passing laws at any level, local, state, here in the United States, local, state, federal, that tell us what we can and can't read, and tell libraries what they can and can't stock, or tell bookstores what they can or can't sell. I just think that is an inherently dangerous road to go down. The two books you mentioned, Mein Kampf and Hitler, and its connection to the evil of the Holocaust and the evil of Nazi Germany, and the fact that, neo-fascists today might be reading that for instruction or for inspiration. That's all horrible, but generally speaking, I think that's something we as a society really should not be legislating against, at least the existence of the book, because that feels like thought control. And as much as I hate the thoughts of the people who would read the book for that reason, until they act on those things, until they do something that means that their reading of Mein Kampf had some kind of real impact on other people, I don't really think it's the government's place to try to regulate what ideas we consume or what we think. And I would just say, in general, what I think we need is not more government regulation of information, but we need to be smarter consumers of information. We need to be wiser about looking at information and questioning that information, particularly, in the online age and the social media age in which we live, in which things can be manufactured, which are completely false. That really responsibility lies on us, and that scares me because, I'm not sure that responsibility is something that a lot of people are willing to take on for thinking through and regulating all those things. But I really don't like the idea of the government telling me what I can or can't read.
I think that governments should have absolutely no power over banning any kind of published material. Is that too revolutionary? Quite possibly. I think, yes, you can say that Mein Kampf is an evil book and should be banned. I mean, personally, I have no problem with that. But I think that the problem comes in knowing where the line is. And I think as soon as you start giving power to governments, they then have the power to move those lines arbitrarily. We see so often in countries that we think are incredibly liberal, like Britain, like America, we see quite a lot governments actually then changing the rules and saying, you know what, actually I don't think trans people have any rights, and you know what, actually maybe we're just going to repeal this law that says you're allowed to get married if you're gay. And I am kind of conflating these kind of like social issues with books, but I think they go hand in hand. And I think we can't assume that just because we have liberal governments and we've somehow progressed to this point of some versions of equality in some countries, that those governments won't be able to take those freedoms away again. And I think as soon as you start giving governments power over the written word, I think that is a very, very dangerous and slippery slope.
The complete distrust of government is super interesting, but I think that in the lack of government regulation, where do these decisions about what does and does not get published and spread throughout the world, I'm sure there's a word that means that. Distributed, thank you. Is left to like commercial bodies, and I don't trust that either. Not that I have a better suggestion, I'm just saying for very suspicious and untrusting answers, they're not suspicious and untrusting enough.
I don't think that banning Mein Kampf or the Anarchist's Cookbook are going to ward off evil or end fascism or prevent homicidal violence. I think it's a slippery slope. Who gets to decide what is appropriate? Do I want these ideas out there? No, of course not. Do I want everybody's inherent human worth and dignity respected and affirmed? 100% yes. Do I think that banning books will make that happen? No. Unfortunately, evil ideas and methods of committing mass violence are not just limited to books and are not going to be suddenly inaccessible if these books are banned. I think really banning them would just give a false sense of security.
The line I would draw is I don't think there's a line. I mean, I don't think they should be banning books at all. I recognize that there is harm, and I think having them accessible, and maybe like with guns, you might have certain books that are difficult. I guess this is sort of like a level of banning, because there needs to be maybe worth having a note of who is reading what. But even then, that's sort of a line that's sort of being crossed there where you're getting a little bit personal. But depending on the difficulty of it, I mean, if we think there's something valuable from that, and people will get access to that, that kind of system might be worth it. If it's between outright banning it and not at all, I'm for not at all. Because realistically, the dangerous material, you can find it elsewhere. You can find copies of it. You can find it on the internet. And at the end of the day, you're sort of criminalizing thought, which I think we have plenty of examples in literature and history of why that's a dangerous line to cross. If we're talking about books that are ideologically harmful, then even then, I think you're shooting yourself in the foot, because people will then try to seek that out. They will give that viewpoint, that book, a added attention because of the fact that you don't want them to read it. If a book is harmful, then, maybe don't advise people to read it, but don't ban it. If you feel like it needs to be addressed, then talk about why it's such a significant book in history and why the problems with it. Give some context to what people will be reading. And if there is no real value there, if we can all agree and recognize that, then I think the books will just die away. It's like the same way that we have books through history that are just blatantly racist. Nobody talks about them anymore because they're just so obviously racist. They have nothing to add to the conversation. Versus, like, say, Gone with the Wind, which somehow was still popular. And even then, like, people talk about it, like myself, even though I haven't read it, and I consider reading it, but it's not because I have interest in it, it's because I want to have a critical discussion about that. And I'm sure the line there is very different, because what is harmful when it comes to Gone with the Wind is going to be very different than some of these other books. But still, I feel as if the conversation that could be had around it, if there's one to be had, needs to be had, more so than just not thinking about it at all, because that's not going to solve the problem. It's just naive.
Government that will be successfully involved in book banning and censorship will also use the same power to corruptly control those citizens that it is apparently governing or ruling. And book banning is a really simple way for a government to inconspicuously gain more control over its citizens and the information that we're able to consume and the knowledge. And it leads to a dictatorship with easier removal of individual freedoms and liberties. Mein Kampf is, in my opinion, necessary to understand history, and it's a tool that we can use, we can read to understand the mind of a dictator who had thoughts and attitudes that he believed were justified in causing the genocide of millions of people. It's important for us to understand history and so we do not repeat it. Something like the Anarchist Cookbook, I think we should put limits on who can get their hands on that, but honestly, with the internet, I think that would be completely ineffective, and I'm not sure we have any power to do that. I would not, however, distribute it in school libraries and make it available to easily manipulated readers.
We're sitting here in the 21st century. We're all online. Everything is available all the time if you look for it. So I think it's an exercise in futility. But in general, I don't think the banning of individual books for whatever political reason on an individual basis is anywhere nearly as concerning as banning either sections of history or political philosophies, or more importantly, entire languages, because that happens quite frequently, and that's more worrying than an individual book.
I think with something like the Anarchist Cookbook, we're assuming that if someone owns material like that they're automatically going to become a psychopath and do something with that. I think if that were the case, then I don't think we would have any book published which tells you how to dispose of a body carefully so that no one knows, or there's no evidence and no one knows that you've murdered anyone, which is pretty much a lot of crime novels, right? So if we're going to start banning material which tells you how to do things like that, then are we going to ban fiction? Are we going to ban... What are we going to ban? Are we going to just start banning everything? And it just seems ridiculous. I think that governments banning books or censoring books in any way. Okay, I'm sorry, but I really like bad analogies, so I'm just going to run with this. You know when you rent a house and the landlord is terrible and all they've done is kind of like washed the black mould off the wall and then painted over it, like that addresses the damp problems in your house. That's kind of like what banning books is. Banning books is a society saying we don't want to deal with the actual problems we have, so we're just going to kind of wash the black mould of society away and hope that everything's okay. You don't stop people from being terrorists by banning books which tell them how to be terrorists. You stop people from being terrorists through a really long-term program of education and of social cohesion to actually join different parts of a society together, not just ignoring parts of your society that you don't want to be there. That's not how you solve a problem.
We have more than half the people we've asked say they think banning books doesn't achieve the goal.
Yeah, for like a bunch of different reasons, but like the main one being that it's no longer our main source of information.
Yes.
And that restricting something as amorphous as the internet is actually very technologically difficult.
I want to hark back on something Rosie said. If we're at the stage where reading is banned,
we're in a shithole.
What has happened before that? It is very hard for us to sort of imagine a world where we wake up tomorrow and there are no books.
But it is a reality that in Texas they're restricting books and access to books based on someone's puritanical idea of morals. But how does that go from there to...
I don't think anybody of our panel would really care if Mein Kampf was banned. I don't think anybody's saying, what about the white supremacists?
Yeah.
I think that there is that, the slippery slope argument and that line of tolerance. But I don't think the reverse is true, in that if you ban all trans literature, then there is actually a legitimate fear that young trans kids will not be able to access any literature about trans kids, and they might not understand their identity, and that can lead to all sorts of mental health issues and all this sort of stuff.
It's certainly not improving the trans experience.
Yes, exactly. When, say, Jen said it, she said it was an exercise in futility.
Yes.
I think if it was an exercise in futility, wouldn't we just be ignoring the banning of books in Texas? Is that what we should do? Should we just sort of like ignore...
I think it is an exercise in futility because it gets a response. Because our response has been to try and find ways to get trans literature to trans kids, to highlight trans literature that wasn't on the list, to, you know, like, those sort of things are what we've done in the response to a government trying to narrow our worldview and the worldview of our children. And that's why it's been ineffective, not we should assume that it's going to be ineffective and then not do those things.
If we deliberately look at the Texas banning of books, one of the things that has come out of it that I think is wonderful is that the Brooklyn Library in New York has said that any teenager in the United States can join them, and that's fine.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And so you have access to ebooks and audiobooks. And
from a huge collection. Yeah, so that it's those kind of respondents that make it ineffective. Doing it on, like, so no, you can't ignore it.
Started to ask people about the difference between censorship and classification. If you consider censorship a spectrum from complete freedom of artist/publisher through to the classification and rating of works, right onto book banning, where do you think it is ideal for government interference and control to sit, and why? So let's see what Kim and Rosie have to say first.
Ratings on books and ratings on things are almost similar to trigger warnings in that it gives me as a consumer the ability to choose what I consume. And if the FTC or the FCC here in the States is the government body that puts ratings on things and puts warnings, whether for whatever content, violent, sexual, whatever it is, if that's as far as they go, I'm fine with that, as long as it's giving me the option to continue to have the content available and it's my individual choice whether I consume it. Artists and writers and content creators should be able to create what they want and leave it up to the free market to decide if their art or literature or whatever they create will be distributed. Leave it up to the free market system.
Kind of like movie classification, but less like extreme, a more mild, more fuzzy version of movie classification, so that you can know without reading the book or looking it up, okay, this is probably safe for children, or this is really contains content that some people might find disturbing, enter with caution. I don't know how that would work, but I feel like something like that would be helpful for everybody, not necessarily imposing super strict rules on creators, although of course it comes down to who is making these decisions. I'm also really in favor of all books across the board having an intro page with content warnings or trigger warnings. And I know this isn't going to be a perfect solution. You're never going to be able to list everything that might be triggering for someone somewhere. But I do think it's a solution where we could get like 80% of the coverage we need really, really simply. If you don't want to read content warnings about a book, you don't have to read that page. You get to just skip it, like all of the stuff about what edition it is and like who the publisher is and stuff. You just flip past them. But if you are someone who wants to avoid or be prepared for certain content that you find triggering, it's there, it's in every book, you don't have to go searching for it. I feel like that would be a really cool system to implement. I don't know who was responsible for that. I feel like it probably should technically be like the publishing industry coming together to say, hey, we've thought of a way we can improve things, but I don't know if that would happen.
I enjoyed that Rosie is much more skeptical of the free market than Kim. These suggestions about like consumer information as opposed to restriction. I think the more information you give people about your products, regardless of what they are, the happier they're going to be with the end result. And so if our aim is ultimately to have people reading the books that are best matched to them, then this kind of consumer information can only be a good thing. I think also it doesn't even matter who is applying the consumer information, because we will all learn how to interpret it. As long as it's consistent, even if it's done by the prudishest, most prude, I will know that when it says, mild sex scenes, what it actually means is no sex scenes, and I will interpret that through my own lens. And I think everyone would have their own version and interpretation of how they interpret movie classifications, and the same would apply if it happened with books. And I think that would be awesome.
I literally could not see why anybody would object to
more consumer information.
I think that this is just such an uncontroversially excellent idea. Now let's have a look at what Josh and Brian have to say on this topic.
Very interesting.
Kind of like the restricted section in Buffy or in other books that I will not name, where there are books that are dangerous that you want to have people checking them out. They're going to be accessible. And I suppose it's kind of like when you have a register for gun owners. You want to know who's owning guns for a reason. If something's dangerous, I can see that being valuable, but outright banning it, again, like I said before, it's just, I don't think it's an effective way of doing it, and it misses the point. If something is dangerous, then find a way of trying to limit the danger or the harm from it. In the same way that I guess the FBI tracks other potential threats out there. I don't know. I don't have a good solution here because I haven't looked too deeply into it. That's my line of thinking. That's the closest I will get to book banning, which is just, they put a barrier of sorts. Even then, though, to call that the government's responsibility, I'm unsure. Like, why can't it be a library's or a book collector's, whatever nature, discretion on what needs to be done that way?
Since I'm against, essentially, censorship of books and ideas, you might suspect that I think that my position might be that a library should stock all books or whatever books they want to. And what I'm going to say my answer here is that I don't have a problem with rating books necessarily. I think a lot of what we call genres are really just kind of guidelines for rating, middle grade, YA, etc. I don't have problems using those categories as a way for librarians to make decisions on what books to put on their shelves. I trust librarians, whether they're school librarians or public librarians, to make those decisions. So I don't have a problem with thinking about genres and trusting librarians to choose the right books. We here in Texas and other places in the United States, unfortunately, we see a lot of efforts to ban books from school libraries. I really just wish we would trust the librarians working in those libraries. I worked in public schools for about 32 years. I've never met a librarian who I would not trust to make the decisions about what books were best to have on the shelf in their library. These people are highly educated experts, and I think the public's desires expressed through the government to exercise direct control over what books are in a library, whether it's a school library or a public library or whatever, that the public desire to do that indicates something I think is a far deeper and troubling thing to me, and that is that we just don't seem to trust as a society people who are experts. I mean, look at all the stuff that went on with people not trusting the vaccines. I think it's always great to have a healthy skepticism about what the government tells you, and to have a healthy skepticism about maybe what doctors and other professionals tell you. But at some level, we have to decide to trust certain people who have those educations, who have that background, who have that experience, to lead us in the right direction. And I see librarians functioning in exactly that same way. I don't know of a lot of librarians who are for banning books who would say, no, I will never have that book in my library, if it's an appropriate level.
The idea that it's the government's responsibility versus the expert's responsibility is the big problem. Like, why don't we trust our librarians? That's what they're there for.
And why don't we trust climate scientists for climate change issues and
why don't you?
Medical people for pandemics and not career politicians?
Yeah, I'm all for a bit of skepticism, and there's definitely been some things come to light about how the medical industry treats fat people and women and people of colour when they complain of pain. They have different responses, and how that moves through care. But when you're talking about debate of facts,
this is something that really gets my goat about politics in general. If you are arguing that you're not going to do whatever it is based on we don't have the cash or we would have to take funding from this program, then I'm happy for that argument to exist. But more and more we're seeing this argument of I don't want to do something about this because what the scientists are saying is not real. what this expert is saying is not real. That's bullshit.
Yeah.
And that upsets me. And I'm
especially when there's like documented proof to back up the expert. Like,
yeah, that's not the job of a politician. That's not two sides of an argument. That is facts and made up lunatics.
No, that is facts and made up things.
Or is that a...
Yeah, I don't think we call things crazy when they're wrong.
Yeah. That's the word I have to stop using. Brian said that he would very much trust a librarian. And do we have a librarian on our panel?
Oh, we'd always trust her. We're not talking to her now. We're talking to a drag queen.
I'd always trust a drag queen.
Definitely over a politician.
Oh my God. Can we have a
Kevin for president?
I want librarians and drag queens to run the country. Only
yes.
I want the librarian party. They can be, I don't know whether that would be left or right, and the drag queen party.
You want them to compete against each other for the balance of power.
I don't know what policy. I guarantee you they'd work better together than...
Yeah, that sounds great.
Maybe it would have to be like a case-by-case basis or something. Because, of course, we know that free speech only goes so far until it begins to hurt other people or infringe on their rights. So, like, the government definitely needs to step in and, like, stop that shit when people are doing, like, evil, bigoted, racist, Nazi shit. Like, cut that shit out. But yeah, other than that, no, they should not be interfering all that much.
I kind of agree with this, but I just want to replace governments with librarians, and then I'm really happy with that.
I think we've come up with a system here.
Yeah.
Drag queens and librarians for... I really think a variety of roles, actually. Doctor? No, maybe not doctor. Like...
I don't think I want Kevin to operate on me. I'm really happy for her to decide how I live. But the point about protecting people from bigotry and from harmful ideologies, especially people who are not intentionally seeking that out in order to learn from it, like people who might be unprepared for that sort of content, I think that's a really important one. I think I agree with our other panelists in that that's not the government's wheelhouse, and that we should be trusting librarians and maybe creating some kind of content warning system.
I think Kevin raises a point that I think gets ignored quite a bit in this argument, that freedom of speech only goes so far before it becomes harmful. I think that this is something that, I mean, because everybody, we're raised in societies that value freedom of speech so much, but freedom of speech, technically that allows hate speech, and that increases suicide rates and all sorts of horrible things.
Yeah, and the idea of free speech as not only a right but a responsibility is supposed to be to keep our government in check via the media. That is how it is a key component to a democratic system, is a discourse in the populace about the efficacy of the government at the time. It doesn't mean that we have the freedom to call each other assholes, and that's not what it's supposed to protect. It's supposed to protect our right to criticize our government without the government silencing us about that. It's not supposed to protect our right to call people less than human.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Now let's go over to our other political candidate, Jen, and her vice presidential nominee, Leo.
Yes.
Feel free to bleep this, but government should just fuck off.
I don't think Jen wants the job.
I don't swear on my channel, don't put that on. If I can swear on your channel, that's fine. Yeah, governments can do one. I know it's a really difficult and confusing place to be, but complete freedom of expression. I think that everybody has a right to publish whatever they want. I think it's down to individuals to have responsibility. I have a responsibility as a citizen of the world not to read crap, not to read racist, sexist, homophobic bullshit. Also, I feel like publishers have a social responsibility not to publish it. Yes, I believe in complete freedom for people to publish whatever they want and for governments to have no interference with that, but it doesn't mean we have to just because we can. I don't think that people should be publishing stuff which turns people into terrorists. Yes, I think we should be spending more time on education to stop people from becoming terrorists. I'm just using that as an example because it was in your first question. I think we have a responsibility as people not to give people platforms rather than just banning them outright. We can't, I don't think we should ban, I don't think governments should have any control. No, don't give them any control, God.
I think the government should stay out of the control and interference of books. Historically, have we ever seen that power used for good? I can only think of examples where the government has abused those powers, usually to control groups of people, ideas, or languages. I see the idea of government trying to control books as rooted in colonization and upholding patriarchy and white supremacy, to impose religious or political ideology, to exploit xenophobia or other bigotry, and probably principally to gain or consolidate power. My answers to these questions are also rooted in my unwillingness to trust the government to make decisions for me about what is appropriate. For example, so many of us white folks have experienced a racial justice awakening and have said things like, well, they never taught us that's what happened. And that was on purpose, I'm sure. And I think while some of that is rooted in our ongoing unwillingness to see the origins of our country or the ongoing systemic racism, it's also true that we weren't taught that these things had happened. Because I don't trust the motivations behind the desire to control these books, I don't trust the government or concerned citizens or protective parents. And I don't want to allow them to silence the stories of people who don't fit the mold for what is deemed appropriate.
How articulate were these two responses? What do we say to it? They're just such...
I mean, other than just wholehearted agreement, finishing with Leo there, he brings up this point about silencing voices, marginal voices or inappropriate voices. And I worry that our free market publishing system does that in ways as a sort of commercialized censorship, if you get what I mean.
I think the stat is in the US that 20% of people are black and something like 60+% of people are white. So if you're going to write a book and publish a book, if you're targeting that to white people, you have a significantly larger percentage of the audience. And then on top of that, you have socioeconomic means. So it makes sense from a profit and loss point of view to target literature to white people who are the majority. And it always makes sense to target the majority.
Yeah, and it's typical publishing house bullshit logic that people only want to read about people who look like them, which is not true.
It's not true, no.
And I think this is a form of censorship that needs to be looked at.
I think the other point that Leo made really well there was it wasn't just governments that Leo didn't trust, it was concerned parents.
Anyone who's trying to police other people's consumption.
If you want to pass a law on this, maybe you shouldn't.
Yeah.
It's very cynical. But
I think it's true. Like, why do you care what I read? Creep? Okay, so we thought that Leo was very interesting and clever, and now our little brains are going to explode. Let's go listen to Jen.
A government can have an official stance on history, say, and you have countries where genocide denial is illegal. But having laws about an official stance on history is exactly the same as the countries where you pay a fine or you can be taken to court for acknowledging a genocide that happened in the past. These are both essentially the mirror images of each other. The official stance on history is what's creating both of those laws. So you can't have a happy medium that says we need to have an official stance on history, because they're both the result of the same philosophy, just with a different view on history. And okay, 20th century genocides are ones where you could say, well, we know what happened, so there is a real story here. But if we go to something a little less controversial, if you go to school in Canada, you will learn that the War of 1812 was a victory for the British Commonwealth forces. And if you go to school in the United States, you'll learn that it was a victory for the US forces. And this is something that is not super important in modern discourse, and nobody has any laws about you need to believe that the British won or the US Americans won. But it is an example of how countries that are neighbors and allies do not necessarily have the same view of history, and so it's really complicated if you start enacting laws that say that there is one view of history. So I don't think there's a happy medium, and that's without getting into the whole really subjective things, like when we get into pornography laws that have the you'll know it when you see it element, because that is so subjective.
Well, this is not somewhere I expected this to go, but this was so interesting.
Yes, I think we were approaching this from like a very fiction reader's point of view, but when you're looking at historical texts that are comparing and contrasting different perceptions and different evidence and things that we don't necessarily know what happened, we're sort of piecing together clues from the past, it could very quickly lead to a narrative that was very government serving if you were to pick and choose which of those texts were and were not allowed. I think that is terrifying. Towards the end, she starts to talk about pornography laws, and it just sounds like kink shaming gone mad. Like, we ban your kink.
Yeah, I think
You're not allowed to be into feet or watching people eat or whatever your thing is.
Jen's able to see the consequences of these potential laws from a completely different angle from some of our other...
Yeah, it's definitely a different take.
I mean, this is why we invite a panel, because having all the same views is... So that brings us to our last question.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about the dangers of censorship, we often talk about government silencing political opponents and dissent. Yet in reality, historically, it is sexual morality that is most commonly limited and policed. Why do you think this is? We've got Brian, Jen, Josh, and Kevy to kick us off on this.
The reason why I think sexual morality is most commonly limited and policed is the same reason I think that really any kind of censorship or book banning shows up, and that's just fear. The people in power are afraid of those who they have traditionally kept from having power. They are afraid that if we really have this kind of equal, open society where we can consume all these ideas, I think they're afraid that people will realize that what the majority group has been saying for so long is just really, really based on lies. You know, it's just we are beyond the pale here in the United States in terms of ridiculous fear, and in particular, a lot of this is focused on the LGBTQ plus population. In terms of books, we are now at the point where we have people on Fox News claiming that liberals are using, LGBTQ books and stuff in schools to groom children into becoming gay, or to be becoming, prey for sexual predation, which is the rankest, most vile type of anti-gay, anti-LGBTQ plus sentiment that I've ever seen. It astounds me that that's where we are. This idea that somehow having a book on the shelf in a middle school, which makes a middle school student who is gay or trans or whatever, that appeals to them and tells them it's okay, that it's okay to be who they are, that speaks to them, that somehow that book is going to, from the point of view of the people who want to censor it, corrupt little heterosexual Johnny, is just such a fear-based reaction that I honestly can't see any logic in it. And if there's no logic in it, I think it just has to be fear. By now, surely, most people know that gay people do not choose to be gay, just as heterosexual people do not choose to be heterosexual. I am a heterosexual. I didn't choose it. That's who I am. And just like I knew I was heterosexual from the first time I saw that little red-haired girl singing in the choir when I was in the 3rd grade, I knew it. The same thing has to be true of LGBTQ plus kids. They know there is something there. They know how they feel, and to think that a book or exposure to someone who is in the LGBT community, or a book about somebody in that community, is going to somehow corrupt a heterosexual into becoming a homosexual, it's just, I don't even have words for it. So what my answer to your question eventually is that I do think it's based on fear, that the people in power are afraid that if the truth were known, if we acknowledge the truth of all these things, that somehow they would lose power, that they would lose standing, that they would have to confront the reality that for their entire lives they have held ideas which are untenable, which are violations of basic human rights and decency, and they're unwilling to confront that about themselves, so they attempt to legislate it away with censorship and book banning and all kinds of other things.
I think it's for the same reason that we now see race being characterized as critical race theory and as this horrible racist thing that has to be banned from all school, which is a big conversation unto itself. But the reason there is we're trying to shield children, or anyone that they have control over, from having access to alternative perspectives. I grew up in the deep South with in a very religious community with a very particular mindset. And I remember from a religious perspective, when I first had that challenge, it was mind-boggling to think that anyone could possibly think differently. Not that they were wrong, it was like the fact that there was an option C or an option B or whatever was mind-boggling. And that is achieved by insulation, by protecting them from a certain type of information that you don't want them to have to think about. And of course, the problem with public institutions is that there is no shielding there, so they get exposed to mindsets that aren't their own. And so it's about keeping them from thinking about it. I mean, Don't Say Gay Bill is the perfect example of that. You don't want children to recognize that their feelings might be representative of a bigger community. So you isolate them. You make it to where there's no way for them to be aware of that community outside of their own head. So they're convinced that there's something wrong with them because, of course, that's the community that they grow up in. It's always just about power and control, and that's the short end of it.
It's because people fucking hate queers. Like, that's it. Even though we have always existed, for some dumbass reason, people hate us. They would rather we didn't exist entirely. They want us dead. They're going to do anything they can to shut down us queers so that they can pretend we don't exist, even though we do.
This is a question I think I've got quite a succinct answer to this. The reason is that politicians, in line with most of society, are completely obsessed with what people get up to in their bedrooms. They're really nosy. They want to know what kind of sex you've been having, and then they want to disapprove because they're not having the same sex. That's the only reason. It's the only reason. On to question 4.
I think that each of those responses comes from their lived experience. If there is a testimony for why excluding people from our stories is a negative thing, those 4 responses, do you know what I mean? Like, from every angle, they show why we have to have all the stories.
Also, I really how good is Jen Sass? Like...
You dirty pervs. Just mind your own business.
I know we've already...
Or go have more interesting sex.
Make a list.
Off you go. Do some experimentation. There's definitely some sort of puritanical desire to restrict people's sexuality that falls outside a certain thing. I think queer people are the centre of that sort of thing. But even straight women, when straight women take agency of their own sexuality, it's often confronting to those in power.
Often the hatred of gay men and the hatred of women, I feel like they often run parallel. I think they come from a very... when I say gay men, I mean femme men, not gay men, I'm sorry. But I think that runs very parallel.
Yeah, right.
So now we have our other 4 panelists, Jen, Kim, Leo, and Rosie.
There was a case about 20 years ago here in Canada where the Glad Day Bookshop, which is a gay and lesbian bookstore here, was importing what I believe was lesbian bondage magazines from the US. It was flagged as violating some of the anti-pornography laws here. That kind of thing is more likely to happen to sexual minorities because they're more likely to be flagged as pornographic in that subjective way. Works that are aimed at or created by sexual minorities are more likely to be viewed as pornographic than ones that are aimed at a heterosexual audience, or at least that aren't obviously lying outside of that. And that is an unfortunate truth of the subjective nature of pornography laws. It doesn't even have to be active discrimination. There's just kind of an ignorance that leads to flagging from even people who I think wouldn't be thinking of themselves as discriminating. That's without getting into people who are actively attempting to ban access to information about sexual minorities, which obviously happens because you see that all the time in media from everywhere from the United States to Saudi Arabia, right? That's out there as well.
Why is a lot of stuff banned for sexual content versus violence or any other content? A lot of governments banning books are doing it out of political dissent, but more often it's because of sexual or sexualized content. Quite often it's because citizens and governments and groups believe that they have the subjective advantage and an enlightened worldview that says sexuality can be legislated, that the government should have control over a person's body, over their choices, over their sexuality, over their gender, and that the government should be able to legislate that. The government doesn't want to take steps to legislate the volume of material that is inherently violent, marketed to children and families and whoever, but they would rather take a stand that they have a right to legislate personal morality, which is completely subjective. It makes no sense.
You can get some interesting results when you Google, "Why is sex taboo?" And as we talk about censorship, sexual morality does seem to kind of rise to the surface, that sex is taboo, sexual morality needs to be controlled, according to those trying to ban these books. A lot of the angry editorials or letters by parents list sexual morality as a reason to ban a book. And I just think it's really interesting in that in the US, the slip of a nipple causes much more outrage than depictions of graphic violence. And I think that is a reflection on who we are as a society. Speaking from the context of the US, we're a country where gay bars were raided, people could be arrested, imprisoned, lobotomized for being gay, being trans was illegal, while at the same time, violence against people of color was not punished and even celebrated. And to be honest, it's hard not to feel like some of these book bans and concerns about critical race theory are an attempt by groups of people to take us back to those times. We're raised in a culture that is shame-based and puritanical, rooted in patriarchy and misogyny. We're in a society where making choices outside the cultural norm is both frightening and castigating. I guess our human nature is to try to assert power and to find those we can assert power over. And in our culture, a lot of that is done by asserting power over women, particularly sexually, and asserting power over those who live on the margins. In the US, at least, we also live in this really strange culture where everything is sexualized and we are taught to police gender and sexual norms from a very young age in every aspect of society. That toy is too girly, those pants make you look too much like a boy, to the little boy, do you have a girlfriend, etc. I'm sure we could all think of a million examples of that. From the time a baby is conceived, we are telling the baby and the parents how they should live and move in the world according to gender and sexual norms. It is so interesting to me that our culture in the US reifies the rebel, but only the right kind of rebel. As long as you fit a perfect idea of rebellion and probably are white, cis, and straight, then you'll be swooned over. But if you defy the norms and rules of sexual morality, that makes you a villain too scary to be allowed within the pages of a book, because that might encourage you to think outside the box that society is trying to put you in. And then what else might you question, and who else's authority might you challenge?
Okay, I have a little conspiracy theory hat moment for the answer to question 3. Feel free to not include it if it's too out there and you wanted a more serious answer. I kind of feel like it's worth thinking about. I think sexual morality is being used as sort of a scapegoat for a desire to keep another kind of control. I think the sexual morality issues that we're seeing in today's world are also about controlling specific minority groups. I feel like it is part of hiding the overall control that certain people have historically held and would like to keep holding. As I said, this is a pretty tinfoil hat take on this question, but I do sort of feel like there's an element of the more we read about, write about as a legitimate topic, things that fall under the sexual morality umbrella, the more people are questioning the fundamental, this is just how you do it, of our society. I know that wasn't directly about the books themselves, but I feel like the themes all tie in, and one of the ways it is expressed is through book banning.
I don't think that was tinfoil hat at all.
No, I think that it was a really acute summary of what else we've talked about, which is sexual morality is used to protect existing power structures. And I think that that's interesting because, number one, a lot of sex happens behind closed doors, which means you can interpret what a person's sexual habits are as you wish. And so it's a really effective way to persecute whoever the fuck you want and protect whoever the fuck you want. And I wonder if that is one of the reasons why it's such a popular means of control, because it's not just one religion or one government that uses sexual morality to shame and oppress and inhibit people. It's really common. So it must be effective.
Yeah, it's over and over again in history. Even if we go to historical settings where gay people are embraced, where third genders exist, there are still sexual norms and sexual deviance within that culture. Can we quickly discuss the little thing that Leo said, how that in the US the rebel is encouraged, but only the right type of rebel? I think that we're actually almost told how we're meant to rebel. We're told...
Yeah, it is acceptable to go and march and shake a picket down the street, but don't boycott a business, or...
Don't stop traffic.
And don't destroy property, or...
Yeah, wherewith, every single law that exists is totally about the protection of property.
Yeah.
And lastly, Jen's observations are... stupid, I would say observational.
You're not smart.
I'm not smart. They're very deep, and they get to the nuts and the bolts and the gears and how it all works. Talking about the Lesbian Bondage magazine.
I find it really interesting what she said about the subjective nature of pornography laws and our own experience framing what is illicit or obscene, because obviously what we've seen in our own bedroom is going to seem normal. And so if you only have straight people making those decisions, then that's what they've seen in the bedroom, and therefore, like, lesbian bondage is going to be a proper freak show.
And it's so representative of almost everything we've been talking about.
Yeah.
It always comes down to the norms. There is one panelist that said something that was just...
It's a whole different topic that we didn't anticipate, but it needs its own attention.
It does.
Question number 3 is, when we talk about the dangers of censorship, we often talk about governments silencing political opposition and dissent, yet in reality, historically, it's sexual morality that's most commonly limited and policed. Why do you think this is? I don't think that is. I don't think it's either politics or sexuality. I think the main thing that is banned historically has been non-dominant language speakers, because there have been, in country after country, century after century, language restrictions and regulations that are repressing non-dominant languages. Even if we just talk about the past 50 years in quote-unquote the West, look at indigenous languages in Canada, look at Kurdish in Turkey. Those laws only started loosening up 20 years ago. Look at Basque or Catalan in Franco's Spain. All of this is not long ago, and that's even without getting into the kind of de facto censorship that you end up with when languages are taken out of public use, especially when they're taken out of the schools, and they just kind of die out. And that, I think, is the biggest censorship.
I think a measure of how effective this book banning that Jen is talking about here is that we researched these questions. We didn't just make them up on the spot. There was research into this, and legitimately what she said caught us completely unaware.
What I think is really interesting is as soon as she started talking, I could think of so many examples, but in Australia, we colonized a country of hundreds of native languages, and now only a handful are still being spoken, and every single one of them is struggling to maintain enough speakers and enough fluency to stay alive.
And we see this again and again. It's not
everywhere.
It's not even a colonial issue. It is.
It's a very much a colonial issue, but also
it's happening to Welsh. It's happening to Cornish. It's happening to Manx. It's happening to Briton. It's happening
It
to...
is as English really and a few other dominant languages really homogenize, and everyone ceases to use less dominant languages. I guess that there's a sort of a natural attrition, but there's also Native Australians used to be punished for speaking their native language. And I'm sure this is true of Indigenous people across the board. Whenever they've been put into a situation where they've been educated by the colonists, that suppression of their native language, it also suppresses native ideas. There are things that English will not have words for. There are ideas that you can't have in English. If you speak Russian, you are more likely to speak in a left-leaning fashion than if you speak in English. You know, there are so many examples of like not having as many words for a colour.
The way you think the internal language that you have is actually a fundamental building block on
how you think. So this is like a really fundamental way of eradicating not just a language, but a culture and a thought process and a history and a people.
And just to go back there, it's a way of eradicating a culture, is what you just said. And this is why this is such a good observation, because if we bring it back to sexual morality, if we bring it back to the queer community, there is definitely a gay culture that goes on, and to try and erase that, it's a repeat.
It is the same thing. It hasn't been as effective because, unlike Indigenous people, gay culture is not hereditary. So they don't actually necessarily speak the same language, but they do need to share stories. And without those stories, the culture becomes eradicated.
That is the end of our discussion. Look, there are 8 absolutely wonderful booktubers here, and I am sure that you're aware of all 8 of them and you're subscribed to all 8 of them.
But if not,
you're not,
go forth.
No shame in not knowing that somebody wasn't there. Big thank you to all 8 of them, and a little apology for how long it's taken us to get this up and organised.
Yes, it has been longer than we intended.
This stuff has happened. And lastly, I'd like to do a little call out. If you have a BookTube channel, or even if you don't, and you would like to appear in our next panel video, the topic will be literary fiction, and everybody is invited.
I want to hear all your thoughts on book banning in the comments. We haven't really drawn any conclusions. This is just the beginning of the discussion. You guys get to carry it on.